All right, this lesson is about turning percents into decimals and decimals into percents. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to write a percent as a decimal, and you should be able to write a decimal as a percent. So we're going to start by looking at this percent. And I want you to think about it or write it down. Can you figure out how you would write 56% as a decimal? All right, we are going to be talking about two methods that you can use to turn a percent into a decimal. In the first method, we can turn the percent into a fraction first. So 56%, you should remember that 56% is the same thing as 56 over 100. Remember, percents are always out of 100. And from that fraction, I can turn it into a decimal. It has 100 on the bottom, so I know it has to end in the hundredths place, and it's 56 hundredths. So this is a method that always works. You can always turn it into a fraction and then turn it into a decimal. The other thing you might want to do is to move the decimal point. So if we look at the number 56%, all whole numbers have a decimal point at the end that you just can't see. We don't put it on there because there's no decimal numbers afterward, but it's still there. When you are turning a percent into a decimal, you are dividing by 100. You're taking it out of 100. So you can move the decimal point 2 spots to the left. So when we move the decimal point 1 spot, we're dividing by 10. And then moving it a second spot is dividing it by 100. Okay, we of course would have to take off the decimal, or the percent sign, sorry. So 56% is the same thing as 56 hundredths after we move that decimal point 2 spots. Let's look at a few more examples with these two methods. Let's say we want to look at 13%. Using the first method, we can turn it into a fraction first. Percents are always out of 100. Percent means per 100. So the fraction is 13 hundredths, which makes the decimal 13 hundredths, ending in the hundredths place. Let's look at another one. Let's try 40%. 40% is the same thing as 40 over 100, which would make a decimal of 40 hundredths. Or you could also write that same thing as 4/10. Okay, those are the same thing. Having a 0 at the end doesn't change the value. Let's look at one more example. Let's look at the example of 7%. 7% is the same thing as 7 over 100, 7 hundredths. When we write it as a decimal, we just need to make sure we put the 7 in the hundredths place. Remember, the hundredths is the second spot after the decimal. So we would have to put a 0 in there since there are no tenths. Let's use the method of moving the decimal point. So if we have this invisible decimal at the end of 13, we can move it 2 spots. And it goes to the beginning of the 1, or front of the 1, I should say. Same thing for the 40. We move it 2 spots, and then it's 40 hundredths. For the 7, this is where you need to be more careful if you're using this method. I take the decimal point, I move it 1 spot. That's dividing by 10. I need to move it another spot. So that's also where that 0 comes in. I have to put a 0 there to hold the spot of the tenths place. Now let's look at if we want to turn a decimal into a percent. So I want you to think about it right now. Think about what method might work for you. Could you write that decimal as a percent? All right, just like in the last one, the first method is that we can write it as a fraction first. So if I have this decimal, I can say it out loud and I can tell that it's 38 hundredths. 38 ending in the hundredths place. Well, since it's out of 100 and I remember that percents are always out of 100, I know that it's 38%. But there's a second method. Just like we used before, we can move the decimal point. But this time we would move the decimal point the other way. So if we're looking at the decimal of 38 hundredths, we can move the decimal point 2 spots to the right. 1, 2. Okay, it's at the back now, and we can add a percent sign to it. So in the last one, we moved it to the left, but if we're making it a percent, we would move it to the right. Let's look at a few examples. 64 hundredths. If I want to write it as a fraction first, I know that it's 64 over 100, 64 hundredths. And because it's out of 100, it's 64%. Let's try another one. Let's do that decimal. I have a 2 and it's in the hundredths place. So I know that it's 2 hundredths, which is 2% because it's 2 out of 100. Here's one that might be a little tricky. Use that. Let's do 4 tenths. So let's say we want to turn 4 tenths into a decimal. I first could write it as a fraction, 4 tenths. But remember, percents always have to be out of 100. So I can do a couple things. I can multiply the top and the bottom by 10 so that my denominator becomes 100. And I'll know that it's 40 out of 100. Another strategy I often use is I might add a 0 to the end of my decimal so that I can tell more easily that it's 40 hundredths. And 40 hundredths is 40%. Let's check to make sure the other method works. So this time I can move the decimal to the right. So I can go 1, 2 spots, and it becomes 64%. With my second decimal, I have 2 hundredths. I move it 1, 2 spots. Now it's 2%. And I'm going to take off the 0 that I added for this one just to show you. I move it 1 spot. I need to move it 2 spots for 100. It has 2 zeros, so you're moving it 2 spots. I would have to add a 0 onto that 4 so that I can go 2 spots. And I can see then that it's 40%. Hopefully this video was helpful. Come see me during WIN if you have more questions.